are working on the Klimt's The Kiss, and we're looking at how it's an image of love or how it's an image of something else. So we're breaking apart into groups working on that.
What's the visual evidence that this is an image about love? What, so like, it was like, kind of like combines like one person with two heads. Like okay, I'm just to make sure we can hear that. So okay, so we have embracing to the point where it seems like it's almost like one body with two heads, right? So I can totally see that. I've never actually even thought about that before. So that's actually kind of cool that you guys were able to see that. That it's like they're so like connected that it's really like it's a two-headed monster, right? And that it's in an embrace, right? What else says that it's an image of love?
So like she has her arms like around his waist, and he has his arms around her face, and then they're like kind of starry night, like kind of romantic, and then their eyebrows closed, and he's like kind of like punched down, like so like he's like kind of like her on the cheek.
Right. So he's kissing her. It's in a romantic location of the starry night. I like that too. You know, they're in a really tight embrace, and you can see arms, you can see hands connecting the two together. Very good. What is visual evidence that this is not quite such a loving relationship? The group two. It's Alana who's going to speak for the group.
I think I'm speaking.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeffrey. Thank you. Sorry, Alana was the typist. Go ahead, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Yeah, so we said like the colors are kind of muted, so like they're not really like particularly like vivid or like vibrant.
Can I stop you there? What is it vivid? Because I look at it and I do see some vivid color. So I want to make sure we really pinpoint where the vivid or where the dull color is, I should say.
Or I guess like more of like the background.
Right?
Yeah.
So the background, even though it's kind of starry night, it's kind of dingy in a way, right? It's kind of dingy. Is there anything else that's kind of muted or kind of a strange color that reinforces the lack of love?
Their faces.
Their faces. When you look at their faces, they kind of have these cool tones to them, and they almost feel corpse-like. You guys see that? They almost feel a little corpse-like. Anything else about this that visual evidence that tells us this might be something other than love? Maybe a little darker?
Yeah, so like the woman's kneeling and they're like kind of in uncomfortable poses.
Her head looks like it's almost like broken. Like she almost reminds me of some of the images of Jesus where his body is broken and his head is contorted. So her head's kind of like at a 90-degree angle. His is too in a way, right? He seems like he's kind of like devouring her in a way, in the kind of the strange angle that he's on top of her. And then anything else about this that tells us it might be something a little bit more tragic than just romantic love? What's the location?
They're on.
What the location is?
Yeah, they're like on a cliff.
They're on a cliff. Very good. And so I really, honestly, when I first, saw this painting, right? I saw it on posters, and I've seen it in calendars and book bags and all these things. And you see it all over the place, and you always think of it as this really beautiful gold painting, very decorative. And we're like, wow, it's about love. But once they put it in the 250, and I started to look at it closely and listen to the smart history about it, I started to notice it's a little bit darker than we normally think. So it does kind of have a lot of undertones. So for content, you guys wrote a lot of great things, so you can add those to your note takers, right? Not in a class, but we have couples embracing wrapped in a cloak, I should say, a cloak. And they're in front of a starry night, and they're on the edge of a cliff, right? They're on the edge of a cliff. And so when you look at it, what's really innovative about it? You can feel free on your own time to review this painting if you want to with Smart History. That's the video that's attached on this page. But what I want to make sure that we understand is that Klimt was taking from other cultures or other art periods when making this painting, right? So he was looking at Byzantine painting, right? Remember when we talked about Byzantine painting, how they used gold and that mosaic to make images and surfaces? And so the cloak, right, that you guys were talking about, has all this gold, and it's in little, on his side, it's rectilinear. So notice his cloak, or his portion of his cloak, has squares or rectangle, and then hers has ovals, right? And so we can see the division of the sexes there, and it has kind of a mosaic-like quality to it. He also was influenced by Japanese art. So just like Van Gogh and Monet and Cassatt before, right? Remember that Japanese art was very, very popular in Europe in the day. And so they were inspired by Japanese art. So remember Corin's plum trees, right? Remember this with that gold background and those strong black lines? You can see him including those kinds of details and styles in his image as well, right? So we talked about a lot of this already. So for form and style, we have that flat cavity of the clothing and the hillside. We have the rectilinear on his and the ovoid or the circular on her side. We have that that warm gold, and then we have those cooler tones that are used for their skin tone. I'm going to drop the lights to you guys a little bit. The colors that kind of muted, and I think it's right here. There's a lot of jewel tones in the ground as well. We have like vines hanging off the edge in gold, but we also have the greens and the reds and the flowers on the hillside. There's a lot of contradiction in this painting, right? So here's some other Klimt so that you can kind of recognize his style. He uses a lot of the patterning and the use of gold, right? Sometimes images of death, right? He was really big painter of Vienna society. And so a lot of these paintings were of wealthy people from Vienna, Austria. And some of the more famous paintings by him are of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And there's actually a book and a movie that came out maybe 5 years ago called The Lady in Gold. This painting on the right was stolen from a Jewish family in World War II, and it was in the National Gallery in Vienna for a very long time, and the gallery or the museum refused to give it back to the family, even though it was obvious that it was stolen. It was obvious that it belonged to this family, and they won a very historic court case. So a lot of artwork that was stolen during World War II in recent history has been returning to a lot of these families. So that finishes up expressionistic painting. So we're going to move into sculpture. We haven't really seen a lot of sculpture lately. We saw neoclassical sculpture with George Washington, but we really haven't seen a lot of sculpture since like the Renaissance time. and Baroque with Bernini. So we're going to go ahead and go back to some sculpture. And so the most famous sculptor of the 19th century is Rodin. And so Rodin had many influences. This is some very famous doors that he made based on Dante's Inferno. If you go to Paris today, you can see reproductions of this door at the Rodin Museum, as well as the Museum des Orsay, which was once upon a time an art school, as well as a train station. So it had a lot of purposes to it. And so Rodin was very much inspired by a lot of the great sculptors before him. So his subject matter inspiration was often from Dante's Inferno, which is a Renaissance, right? Renaissance story, right? But he was also influenced by Ghiberti and the Doors of Paradise in Florence, right? But he was also inspired by the sculptures of Michelangelo, right? So he did studies of anatomy just like Michelangelo did. His famous doorway that he made for this art school in Paris has many, like when you look at it kind of close up, some of his most famous large sculptures are actually incorporated in the door. So what basically he did is he designed this doorway, and then he kind of used little scenes from this door based on Dante's Inferno, and he made it into large sculptures. So if you look right on the lintel, here's his most famous one, the thinker, right, dead in the center, right? And this door is not very functional, right? It's very sculptural. So it has really deep relief as well as sculpture that kind of projects out of the surface. This one right here, that's the thinker right there, right? So here we have the thinker, right, by Rodin. And even though Rodin really isn't an impressionist painter, his work does have some similarities with some of the impressionists that we've seen. Can anyone think of anything that's similar about this sculpture over here with the style or the content of the impressionists? These are the two impressionist works that we have in the 250. So we have Monet and we have Psyche. So is there any similarities that you see? Here. You can go ahead and have a seat. You might, perfect. Right, does anyone see any similarities? Related to impressionist artwork?
It doesn't have a lot of details, and like it kind of looks, I don't know, like the skin doesn't look very smooth or like defined.
Very good. His work kind of captures a moment of time. This one is kind of quiet contemplation, but we'll see in other artworks as well. It's almost like they're kind of frozen in space. And then, like you were just saying, it's very rough. And so you can often see sort of like the marks of the artist, right? So you can see that his muscle definition, his interest in classical anatomy, but you also, it's not perfectly refined, it's not perfectly smooth. It kind of feels like clay sketch. How a lot of sculptors will work on clay studies before they make it into something more permanent. And something that Rodin did a lot is he personally never really carved in stone or bronze himself. What he did is he modeled in clay. So he would use soft kind of oil-based clay, and he would model it. So you could actually see like his finger impressions in the clay body, right? Because he made it kind of fast. And then, just like so many other artists from previous times, he had assistants. So he had a studio assistant who would either carve it in stone or they would cast it in bronze, right? And he would oversee the process. So that doesn't mean that he didn't carve anything, but he did a lot of refining and smoothing and like finishing rather than starting an artwork from start to finish. So he would basically, in clay, he might model it in clay, right? And then they might make a cast to cast it in bronze from that clay cast or clay model. But his assistants would be the ones to do all that hard labor, right? And he oversee, like I said, he kind of oversaw the whole process. When you look at the work of Rodin, there's normally two different styles. The bronze work is very rough, right? So the bronze work, you see the marks, the finger touches of the artist, you see their marks. In the stone work, it's a little bit more smooth and refined. So like if you have loving embraces of a couple, their skin is going to be smooth and refined, and maybe the pencil would be less rough. So the image that they've included in the Tribute by Augustus Rodin is the Burghers of Calais. It's number 119, so you can take your notes in your name takers. All right. So this was commissioned by a French city called Calais, and it was to commemorate the heroism of a group of citizens. And so there was a group of citizens. There were 6 of them, in fact, that during the 100-year war against England sacrificed themselves for their town and for their people. So this is not a religious sacrifice. This is more of a political sacrifice. So basically, this group of elders in the community gave themselves to the English rather than having the English take over the entire city. And so this French city, many centuries later, decided to commemorate this important event. The leader of this group, which I speak French horribly, was this Dame Saint Pierre, right? So he was kind of the head of it, and this is the guy, that's him right here, the man in the beard at the bottom of the image. So such is an function is commemorate these 6 heroes. Right? So I wanted to kind of show you some other sculptures from this time, right? So you probably recognize the middle one, which is the Statue of Liberty, right? And then this one is on the Arc of Triomphe in Paris. So maybe some of you have seen this one before. How is this sculpture different than other historical sculptures of the day? Take a moment to look at it. How do you think it's different, right? How do you think it's different than other historical images of the day? Does anyone want to volunteer? Anyone?
I think the sculpture feels a little more human, like there's a wider range of emotions. And like one person even has like their head in their hands.
Right. So there's like more like human emotions, and you kind of see the essence of the individual. So a lot of, the Statue of Liberty is like a personification of liberty. It's not depicting a real person per se, right? And then this one is also basically a political piece. This is also victory, right? The winged Nike at the very top with classical nudes, right? At the very base. That's another kind of revolution sort of image. And they're very like stylized, they're very perfected, they're like more like symbols of people, right? But on the Calais one, it's much more realistic in its depiction. So when you look at it, we've got 6 different features or 6 different figures, and it's kind of hard to be able to tell who are we supposed to notice? Like, what's the focal point? When we look at images like this, right, we're like, oh yeah, definitely the Statue of Liberty. She's the most important person, right? Your eye goes to the sculpture itself, right? Or in the the triumphant arch, right? We notice the 9 feet at the very top. But with this one, it's a little bit more tricky. Is there any particular area that stands out the most? Right? Maybe not really, right? When you look at it, just like Jasmine was mentioning, there's a lot of different emotions. And so you're probably going to be drawn to whatever is maybe closest to you when you're standing around looking at it, or maybe whichever emotion it is that you personally are connecting with. And it's very similar to other pieces that we've had in the 250, right? Rodin's going to know about, right? He's going to know about like the Last Supper by Da Vinci. Remember how the disciples sitting at the Seder table, they all have different reactions to the miracle of the blood and the bread, or the wine and the bread, right? Or the reactions that someone's going to betray. Some of them are startled, some of them are angry, some of them are confused, some of them are thinking about it rationally, right? And Giotto, remember with the lamentation, we've got all these different elements of people kind of reflecting on the death of Jesus. And when we look at this group of 6, we see all these different emotions. They are all sacrificing themselves. They may be killed, right? They're going to be in prison. They may be killed, and they're all reacting to it in their own sort of way. So we have the stoicism of the lead guy. So St. Pierre, he's very stoic, right? Then we have this other guy who's kind of resigned as well. He looks a little bit more like determined. His lips are pursed. We have another one who is like in anguish, right, with his hand raised. We have the other guy who's got his hands in his head, his head in his hands, and they're all kind of contorting and bending in space, right? So they're all reacting in their own sort of personal way, right? Another interesting thing is Rodin, when he made this, kind of made people of Calais a little upset. And one of the reasons is he intentionally did not put these people on a pedestal. This was a later representation of what people in Calais wanted, where they raised it on a higher podium, but he intentionally put it on a low podium. Why would Rodin choose to do that? What does that do for your interaction with the artwork? What do you think? Isabella, any idea? Why did it sit at lower and at eye level?
So like the viewers could like empathize with them.
Right, so that you would really empathize with these individuals. You would be face to face with their faces, right? You would be face to face with their anguish, right? You would see their hardship. And so he roots them kind of in the ground, and it was supposed to be viewed on very low. Like I said, his idea was to put it low, right? But in Calais, they wanted it a little bit more elevated because they wanted to make it prestigious. So sometimes it's viewed like this. And you might notice, I've showed you a bunch of different photos from different locations. Just like printmaking, you can copy or repeat in bronze if you make a cap that's permanent. So Rodin would work in a cast that he could use over and over and over again. So a lot of his artworks are in multiple museums and locations around the world. So there's one at the Art Institute, but probably also at the Rodin Museum in Paris, which also could be at the Louvre or Museum d'Orsay. And so there's a lot of different examples of his work around because he was able to make the same sculpture over and over again. He wouldn't make too many because that would bring the price down, but there might be 2 or 3 or 4 copies of the same sculpture. These last ones are by Camille Laudel. She was actually an assistant to Rodin, as well as one of his lovers. And so he sometimes would write his name on her artwork. And so it wasn't until the 20th century that she was actually given a lot of credit for some of the artwork. But of course, like I said, he had a workshop of artists who did a lot of the work for him. But some of her pieces were completely independent. This is one that's from our book. And here is an image of Rodin and his wife. And she kind of looks like this, his wife kind of looks like an evil witch in a way. And she's embracing him and pulling him away from Camille right here. So she made a little portrait of herself. Okay. The next piece that we have is a little bit later, right? This is number 129, The Kiss by Constantine Grunt. So we have another kiss. Right? So we're going to watch the video on this one. And as we watch the video, what I'd like you to do is to focus on how it's different than traditional sculpture and what were his influences, right? So how is it different and what are his influences? Sorry. I think the other teacher turned on. Okay.
Huh. It says it's muted. My computer won't turn on its sound. So that's odd. Okay, well, that's okay. We can just talk about it then. Gotta have some sort of snafu after break, right?
Okay, let's see if we can figure it out for ourselves. Right. So in the video, they talked a little bit about Constantine Brancusi. He was not from Paris. He was actually from Romania, and he was academically trained in Romania and moved to Paris because the center of the art world in the 19th and the 20th, at the beginning of the 20th century, was in Paris. So if you wanted to be a famous artist, or if you wanted to be an artist in general, many of them moved to Paris. And so he was influenced by primitive art. So when I say primitive, I mean artwork that he would have considered to be primitive. I'm not using that as a word myself. So primitive art in this kind of time period, what they felt that it was, is from lands that had been colonized. So they were often influenced by art that was brought back from Africa, Asia, Central, South, North America, and brought to Europe. And so they were often inspired by the art of other cultures. He was also inspired by folk art. So folk art would have been more like craft, right? And so this would have been from his native Romania. Right? So let's compare our two pieces that we had today. How is Brancusi's minimal, right? What's minimal about it? Who can help me out? Raphael, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking that it's very simple. The facial features are like, it's just the eyes and mouth. There's no nose.
Right, very, very simple. So it's very anthropomorphic. Look at our reviewer, anthropomorphic. Remember our anthropomorphic stele, where it's got these human-like qualities, but it doesn't look like any human you've ever seen before, right? And so we have those basic human qualities. Like Raphael said, it has eyes, it has lips, it has hair, we have arms, and very minimal bodies. Something else I forgot is that one of them has a breast. So one of them is female and one of them is male, right? They lack a lot of detail, right? They don't look like any human that you've ever seen before. And they're very cube-like, right? He would have been working from raw stone. And so when a sculptor gets a piece of stone, usually it's in a giant block, like you see right here, right at the very bottom of the slide. And so he keeps the essence of that original block. He keeps it so that you know that this is stone, right? And so that kind of helps you with the understanding of this piece. It gives you, so like context-wise, right? This kiss, this love, is basically forever. Does that make sense? It's like locked in stone. It's frozen. Like that hard stone that it's made of. And so the influences for this is basically something we haven't really even talked about yet. So this is a little bit later of a piece. So it's inspired by Cubism. Now Cezanne, right, who we've talked about for post-impressionists, remember that he is really interested in form. So when I say form, I don't necessarily mean just three-dimensional form. I mean that he's really interested in this act of painting. And the Cubists were just like this. Their artwork is all about making marks on the canvas, analyzing space, analyzing color and brush strokes. And so they kind of have a geometric sort of fracturing or qualities to it. And so for a lot of sculptors, it led to things being very geometric or very kind of like basic, right? So this one is called Torso of a Youth, right? So you really just see parts of the leg and parts of the chest, right? And so it has kind of a block-like characteristic to it, right? And so that was influenced by people like Picasso. And Picasso was a sculptor too, so Brancusi would have known him. And so he would have been influenced by that geometry and that minimalism in his sculptures as well. Like I said, he as well as people like Picasso were really influenced in art from the colonized world. So these are inspired by famed sculpture from Africa, right? And so notice how you see the brow, right? It's very much influenced by the mask of the fang, right? And then this is one of his most famous pieces. There is an example of this one at the Art Institute Chicago, and it's called Bird in Space. Bird in Space. And when you look at this one, you're kind of like, where in the heck is the bird? Anyone else feeling that? Like, where is the bird? Is this an image of a bird? Not really. This is an image that's about the essence of flight, right? So it's more like symbolic of flight. And Brancusi really loves material. He had examples of this in stone. He had examples of this in bronze. And he really thought that the type of the material kind of influenced your meaning. If it was a really raw material, he used it for really things like human emotions. And if it was more of a smooth, refined, he used it more for symbolic things. As well as if things were close to the earth, he would make them very raw. And then as they would move up into space, they would become more simplified. One of my favorites are this little egg-like piece, and of course we just had Easter, so city. Can anyone see what it's an abstraction of? This little egg. Can you see what it's an abstraction of? No one ever sees it until I give you the name. It's called newborn. And so he made these in all different materials. Here's like a piece of marble one. Can you guys see how it's a baby with their mouth open and their little tongue and they're screaming? It's like they just been born and they're like stuck in this cold world and they're very unhappy. And so it's that newborn baby face where they're so upset that their mouth and they're like shaking in fear or shaking in anger. And so that's what this is an abstraction of. Okay, so that is the end of sculpture. Any questions on that? Okay. So we're going to move into architecture. We're going to be looking at innovation in 20th century architecture. And so we live near a really cool city, right? So everyone loves going to Chicago, or most people love going to Chicago. But does anyone know why Chicago was an important city in the rise of modernist architecture? Does anyone know? Anyone have any ideas? I'm going to shut this so I'm not feeling like I'm screaming here. Does anyone know? Yeah, Aaron.
The Sears Tower or the Willis Tower.
Whatever it's called nowadays. It is one of the reasons, that's one of the reasons why it's really known in like contemporary architecture. Is the architecture firm is like known worldwide, but it even goes a little bit earlier than that. Anyone else know what happened in Chicago? The Chicago fire. And so the fire of Chicago in what was it? What year? 1871. I was going to say 1863. So I'm glad I looked. The Chicago fire basically leveled a section of the city. And that section that you see in red was basically devastated by the fire. And so it was a horrible thing, obviously, but it almost gave the city kind of like a blank canvas where they could decide how they wanted to create a new city and what kind of architecture they wanted to incorporate. So a lot of architects made their way to Chicago to kind of build these big buildings. And this is actually the kind of the invention of the skyscraper during this time, right? So in the city of Chicago, there are basically two different styles of architecture that took off in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And one of them is Historianism, right? Historianism. We talked about that before with like neoclassical and romanticism. This idea of looking back at the past. This is an example of the old Marshall Field. Marshall Field, you guys are pretty young, so it used to be a department store. Macy's bought it out, and I think Macy's is probably gonna get bought out soon too. But it was a really important department store where people would go to get pretty much everything, right? Especially like everything that was like nice and high quality compared to like something like Sears. What kind of style was this building of Marshall Field inspired by? What style? Is this Gothic? It's not Gothic, right? It's not Gothic. It's more like Romanesque or Roman. It has rounded arches. It has kind of like this rough sort of stone. And so a lot of buildings were built on a colossal level. They were very large, and they were built in this historical style. So when you walk around downtown, you're going to see skyscrapers that look Gothic. You're going to see skyscrapers that look Art Deco. You're going to see skyscrapers that look Romanesque. There's all these different styles incorporated into some of these buildings. And so the piece that we have for early modern is this Louis Sullivan image, and this is Carson Fury Scott. How is his work different than Richardson's Marshall Field's? How is this one on the right different? Any ideas? It's much more clean and pristine. So this is number 124. This is the Carson Pierre Scott building in Chicago, right? So we do have another piece in Chicago, besides our African host, right, our veranda host. We also have the Carson Pierre Scott building. And this is by an American architect named Louis Sullivan. And so we have two images for it. We have the entire building and we have the entryway for this building. Right? So for his piece, he used innovative materials of the day, right? So he was using new building practices that had just been invented. So places like Chicago and New York, we start to have things like skyscrapers or buildings that have multi-stories, and things like elevators are invented. But also we have building materials that are being used that allow these pieces, these buildings to get bigger and bigger and bigger, as well as to be made faster, right? So this has a steel structure. So it has steel I-beams that make it into a grid-like pattern. And then he covered it in white terracotta tiles. So it has kind of this clean and pristine sort of finish to it. It looks very like refined. It also has really large windows, right? So especially at the bottom of the building. But it also has these large windows on the other upper stories. And it has bronze decoration in the first two floors. So the exterior of the building at the very big bottom is done in bronze. And then from the third story all the way to the top, it's done in this white terracotta. So how is it modern, right? What makes this different than buildings that came before it, right? It's based on the principle of what Louis Sullivan called form follows function. Make sure that you write this. We're going to be looking at a few different architects in the next few weeks, and they're all going to kind of base their architecture on some different concepts. And the idea of form follows functions is one of the most important concepts of early modern architecture. So let's figure out what that means, right? What is form follows function? It basically means that the shape of the building, the components of the building are going to relate to the function and its purpose. Now, this is not a concept that hasn't existed before. You think about a church, right? A church has a central aisle, you use it for processional, it leads you to the altar or the most sacred spot. Form follows function doesn't, existed before, but Sullivan named it, right? And he thought very carefully about how he designed this department store, because Carson Pierre Scott was a department store as well. He thought very carefully about how to organize it to make it ideal for business. Okay, so it has what we call a triprioritized design. And this was something that Sullivan coined. This is a building by Sullivan that I skipped. It's in St. Louis, because he's an architect from the Midwest. And what he basically would do is he would divide his building into 3 parts. So the bottom section, right? The bottom section of the building is made for public access, right? So he designed it for public access. So it was a department building. So this is where Carson Pierre Scott was. This is where most people went, the first 2 stories. This would be where you would go in and buy your t-shirts, and you would buy your shoes, and maybe some pillows for your couch, okay? The next few stories would be office buildings or offices for Carson Pierre Scott. It might be smaller rooms and things that were made for only particular parts of the business, as well as rented out to other businesses. So these middle sections were for offices. And then the very top section, so the very top floor, the very top section of the building is called the attic story. And this would be kind of like the end of the design. He would incorporate a lot of the kind of inner components of the building at the very top. So things that you wouldn't want to see, like ventilation ducts, right? Of course, today we probably would be like, you know, heating units and like air conditioning units and all that stuff is hidden in that cornice and hidden by that projecting cornice. So you can't see it from the ground when you're standing at the store, at the ground level of this, right? So thinking about form follows function, it's focal point, right? Where does the eye go when you're at the corner of State Street and Calais? Now I can't remember it, right? We normally walk by this on our field trip in the spring, but what you notice is the corner of the building. Notice how it's not square, it's rounded. And one of my good friends is an architect, and he used to work for Gensler, which was like on the fifth or the sixth story. And this was kind of like this beautiful round room on the corner where you would have these great views of State Street. And at the very bottom, this would be the entryway into the store. And so you see these beautiful bronze or wrought iron decorative elements. This is in a style that we call Art Nouveau. We'll look at it a little bit later in the semester. But basically, it's a style that's based on vegetation. So the style of the arabesque, right? And so it's very beautiful and very decorative, kind of pull you in, right? So that's the entryway that you guys have in your image set. Notice how arabesque-like the details are. And then it has these large windows. So the Carson Scott building is now a Target, of course, right? And so notice how large the windows are. You can see the merchandise inside, right? So form follows function. Bottom stories have large windows to let you see the merchandise, right? And then it has an open floor plan. So notice these posts are really tiny. So you could move around the setup. If it was an Easter sale, you could put the bonnets and the gloves and the fancy shoes in the front, right? And you could make the space big, you could make the space small. So there weren't walls separating the building, right? And so you can kind of move it around based on whatever your need was. So your form follows your function, right? The office space had large windows as well, so that you could have beautiful views of the city, right? And then how is it not modern? It has a lot of decorative elements that you don't really notice until you're looking close up. Obviously, it's got the Art Nouveau and the bronze, but it also has a lot of stucco and terracotta work on the tops of the capitals, on the cornice. In between the windows, actually has mosaic style as well, right? And so that's Frank Lloyd, excuse me, that was Moon Sullivan. The next architect we have is Frank Lloyd Wright. He also was a Midwestern architect. This is the Roby House, which is also in Chicagoland area. This is in Hyde Park, right next to the University of Chicago. And so this is the style that we call the Prairie School. So the Prairie School was the inclusion of a household building in its natural environment. And there was often horizontal slabs so that would conform to its natural environment. So before Hyde Park was like built up, it was basically a prairie. The only thing really here was the University of Chicago. It didn't have a lot of the urban sprawl yet. And so when Frank Lloyd Wright styled this building or designed this building, he really wanted it to kind of be level with the prairie, right? This is a flat area, right? We live in a very flat location here in Illinois. And that you have all these balconies that you can overlook the prairie and enjoy the wildlife outside. So it has a lot of horizontal slabs. Most of them are going one direction, but it also has contrast going perpendicular. It has 3 stories to it, and it was basically designed so that the first floor, so this floor is kind of like the play area for the Roby family. This was where they had like a billiard table and a playroom for the children. The middle section had a living room and dining room, and then the top section had a bedroom. And the design of it was really controlled by Frank Lloyd Wright. Just like we'll see at Falling Waters, he designed everything. Frank Lloyd Wright designed the furniture, the stained glass windows, the light fixtures, the built-ins, the lighting. He even designed a dress for Mrs. Roby to wear when she was having guests in this dining room. He was kind of a control freak. He designed all elements of these buildings. So Prairie School is very like Art Deco. It's very simplified, it's very refined, right? So that leads us to 139, Falling Waters, right? This is Falling Waters by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so this is not in Chicago, this is in Pennsylvania, but it's still done in that prairie style, right? So it's in southwestern Pennsylvania, and this was made for a department store mogul named Carson. So often it's actually called, instead of Falling Waters, a lot of people actually call it the Kaufman House. And so the Kaufmans owned this area. They owned some land in southwestern Pennsylvania, and the family would go back to this location and swim all the time. And so Frank Lloyd Wright was said to have designed this as he was like driving from like Chicago to Milwaukee, or from Milwaukee to Taliesin, which is his studios in Wisconsin. Like he designed it in a really relatively short amount of time. But he designed it to go over this little babbling brook that the Kaufmans used to swim in. Right? So this is Falling Waters. Let me show you how, we might not have sound since my sound is off, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is show you this animation. I'm going to unpause the video here though, so that it can't be copyrighted.